Resident Evil, one of the most well-known horror franchises ever released since back in 1996, has had quite its fair share of ups and downs over the years. On one hand, the series has created some absolute icons for games that even players outside of the fanbase recognize as masterpieces. On the other end, the series has had some questionable hiccups. But I'm not here today to fanboy over the best games or criticize some of the worst ones. Instead, I'm doing a much different type of video, one that I'm not used to making whatsoever. But first, let me give just some background context. Resident Evil 2 had come out a little over a year ago, and fans were absolutely ecstatic about what could come next for the series that had now forged its path as one of the leaders in the survival horror franchise. What they got, though, was quite a change of pace, to put it lightly. Resident Evil 3, released in 1999, decided to take a large leap away from the slow-paced tension type of horror, instead electing for a fast-paced, desperation-based horror, as a new, terrifying enemy chased you around and became the poster child of the entry itself. Nemesis was nemesis to the player for the entire duration of Jill's escape from the destroyed Raccoon City, creating a new sense of terror the series hadn't dived into all that much. This game was really well received by many at the time, to say the least. Adding Nemesis on top of a shorter entry that made it easier to replay over and over, plus the unique environments, the boss fights, and the characters, it's easy to say this game is highly ranked in many eyes of the fans to the series. So when a remake was announced in 2020, there were already high expectations. Fans were already riding off the high that was a remake for the second game in the franchise, a massive success for Capcom, and the source material was loved by many of those who grew up with the series already. It had big shoes to fill. Unfortunately, though, it really didn't do that. In fact, the remake was a largely notable letdown for a large number of reasons. Scrapped content, scripted moments overtaking a large chunk of the game, significantly less detail for a game made in the RE engine, plus the reviews from both critics and fans were much more divided this time. In my honest opinion, I think both sides are right for their own reasons, and after thinking on this idea for a long while, one in particular started to bubble around in my mind. What would an ideal version of a remake for the third game have looked like? One where it both appealed to the old fans that loved the original, while still feeling like a fresh experience for the newcomers. Today I'm here to really explore that concept, the idealized version of the Resident Evil 3 remake that could have potentially been a reality compared to the divisive entry that was created a few years back. I made this in a kind of podcast style to where you could sit back, relax, and do other things while this plays in the background, so don't feel obligated to sit in one spot for the entire duration of this video. To get an idea of how this is going to play out, first we need to understand how the two games hold up on their own. I played both of these games and really soaked up the experience as if I were playing them for the first time, but I did also take some notes on the side regarding every little aspect I could think of while each game played out. After dissecting each game on its own, we can then really start to compare and find out what each one did better than the other in order to start conceptualizing what the ideal version of the remake could have been. And with everything put together, we can run through a visualization of what could have been the perfect Resident Evil 3 remake. To begin, let's start with the original version of the game back in 1999. I actually ended up playing this one second, simply because I want to review the remake as a separate game, rather than an adaptation to the original material 2 decades before it. Going into this game, however, I found myself picking up the tank controls and item management fairly quickly, which felt rather nice. The game's introduction already starts off really well, showing the city in disarray as people flee from the rapidly increasing hordes of zombies that roam the restless streets, the cops trying to do all they can to contain this outbreak with little avail. It already starts the player off with a feeling of sheer dread, with the large-scale disaster that the game prior had set up before it, and then the player gets reintroduced to Jill Valentine. Already having been in character back in the original game, seeing a familiar face for this game creates intrigue as to what she'd been doing in the city during her time after the incident in the Spanish Dimension, and was of course enjoyable for the players who were already established fans of the series. After assuming control of Jill, the player begins their journey in an abandoned warehouse, getting accustomed to new controls, like being able to do a quick 180-degree turn, and learning about dodging enemies with some well-placed timing, as well as a crafting system where gunpowder scattered throughout the game can be combined and turned into ammo with the use of a reloading tool, which created further incentive in regards to item management, as players would have to decide to either craft the ammunition to save them in the short engagements against the zombies, or stockpile to craft beefier explosives and magnum rounds that could make or break boss fights. The player and Jill get to explore the uptown area for a brief bit, letting the player settle into the playstyle of managing key items, with ammo, healing items, as the zombies roam the desolate streets. But soon Jill finds herself in the RPD, a large chunk of where the former game had taken place. However, this is also where the player encounters the exact moment where the game lets you know that this isn't going to be your slow-paced, tension-building type of game. No, it's right here where two key elements are introduced to the game: Nemesis and the choice system. As the player brutally watches Brad Vickers get killed off, Nemesis turns its attention to Jill, and the player is forced to make a choice. The screen flashing, the sound of a heartbeat enveloping the air as the game offers to let the player either flee or pray that they can fight this thing off, just as they fought off the zombies before. Already the player is forced to dive headfirst into this new type of horror, this desperation, as the player knows how deadly this creature is, and must decide if they want to use up their resources to take it down now, or to run and hope it doesn't pursue them any longer. This simple mechanic alone creates a wonderful new approach to horror at the time, a horror not defined by slow rising tension that eventually leads to a strong scare or feeling of disgust from the creatures, but rather smacks the player in the face with a sense of dramatic intensity, desperation, raw terror that both options could have dire consequences, yet choosing nothing is only worse. What makes this even better is that it rewards the player for being bold and actually facing off against the Nemesis, awarding the player with a key item that allows them to skip a later section, as well as gun parts if they do manage to overpower the terror before them, creating a strong, yet well-executed blend of fear, but also accomplishment. Continuing on from this encounter, the player gets a brief but nice revisit to the RPD, being able to get a little more backstory from notes found on those who had to fight within the station's walls and what became of them, while also lightly teasing at the future puzzles that Jill will have to face later on in the story. It's also here that one other thing becomes quite clear. Nemesis isn't just a typical enemy that you take down in a couple shots. As the moment Jill is done with him in the RPD and decides to make their way out, he crashes in through a window with a freaking rocket launcher and tries to go to town on poor Jill. Again, the player can choose here to either fight and hope to cash in some more gun parts, but it's more likely that the player is going to make a break for it before being splattered on the walls or have to waste their first aid spray they just got earlier. From here on out, Nemesis will become a very constant issue for Jill and anyone trying to aid her to deal with across the span of the game. He will show up at the most inconvenient moments, forcing the player to make quick decisions on how to deal with him, which usually ends up being to run until they can find somewhere that he can now follow into, serving as only a brief escape from the terror pursuing them. This new approach to a stalker enemy, one far more ferocious than what Mr. X from the previous game was like, is absolutely fantastic, and only continues to shove the sense of terror into the player as they explore the rest of the uptown and eventually downtown segments of the city. Jill will also encounter other characters here, namely Carlos, Mikhail, and Nikolai, who are all here under Umbrella with the orders to clean up the outbreak within the city of a subpar result. To be quite honest, I only saw Carlos as having much substance throughout this story, as the others really didn't progress the story in notable chunks besides Mikhail being injured and the leader of the squadron, while Nikolai did some shady operations in the background, so I'm not going to discuss them too much throughout this. However, I personally believe that it's during all of this that there is one kind of glaring flaw, and it's that the city section is long, especially compared to later segments that the game has. It's definitely not the worst complaint to be had, but the pacing in this game when it came to the environments was sometimes not always in favor of the game. The most notable offender for this came while repairing the trolley, so that Jill and the others could escape the city. Getting the fuse in the power cable wasn't really an issue, with them being fairly close and easy to retrieve with some puzzle solving. The real problem came from the fuel, specifically the oil additive. Making the player run all the way from the trolley towards the back of the downtown section to the sales office of town was kind of a chore and a half, and honestly felt like a real slog in a game where constantly feeling the need to keep moving from location to location as Nemesis pursued Jill was an essential aspect. Retracing our steps to just one single location of the uptown just didn't feel all that satisfying in the end, followed by more running to get all the way back to the tram, with a couple Nemesis encounters and a not-so-eventful moment in the parking garage to fill the space. After all that though, Jill finally makes it to what I consider by far to be the best segment of the game, the clock tower. This area is a really good way to define what the original Resident Evil trilogy was like. Unique puzzles in order to obtain key items like the gears, strange enemies, spiders crawling about tight areas, slow dread from the absence of zombies and the Nemesis until they arrived at the most sudden times, which also led into the desperation this game had already made itself known for as you run away or fight, managing the keys and other items with the weapons and ammunition you've already gathered. The segment was just beautifully crafted, all culminating into by far the most intense battle with the Nemesis, I would say in the entire game, either wielding his rocket launcher or a new tentacle attack based on how the player chose to deal with the trolley prior to the clock tower. The stakes are made even higher, and yet it never overstays its welcome as compared to the city environment, which can get somewhat stale with the amount of backtracking the player sometimes faces. There's a nice transition here as the player gets to play as Carlos, wielding a powerful assault rifle to shred through the hordes. Carlos' main time to shine, however, comes with the hospital just after fighting Nemesis as Jill, once again being brief, but also unique in compared to what the players already encountered. It's here the hunters are introduced, also being a nice counterbalance to the assault rifle, as they do require heavy firepower to deal with properly, while Carlos has to develop a vaccine through solving more puzzles. Like the clock tower, it doesn't overstay its welcome, only being a few rooms overall with enough content to feel interesting and unique, but wrap itself up and keep the player moving before they get too comfortable. Back in Jill's shoes, another quick section occurs with the park, being another sharp transition from the urban streets and buildings to lots of greenery, water, deadly sliding eels or worms that'll hook onto Jill and sap her health, more hunters that are far harder to dodge and need good shotgun blasts or two to take down, and a fight with the large gravedigger set fittingly enough inside a dugout graveyard. Once again, just enough time to feel unique, but isn't drawn out. Then comes the final area, the Dead Factory. Like the clock tower, this area is a strong suit for the game, and a welcome change of pace compared to the generic laboratories. This place serves nicely as a final area as well, and it knows that, usually dealing with less zombies and more hunters and drain damos that can poison you, chunk out large portions of health, knowing that by then you probably have a much stronger arsenal, even if you never directly fought for the better weapons that the Nemesis can drop. You can get a magnum, a grenade launcher, and a shotgun, all with a good amount of ammo for them each, depending on how you use the gunpowder. It also once again balances fighting enemies and the Nemesis, if you did chuck him off the bridge, with puzzle solving that the series has become known for as you open up different areas of the factory, up until the final encounters with the Nemesis. Now fully mutated from all the battles between him and Jill, it's a 1v1 duel between his new attacks and your hard-hitting arsenal. The first fight is a little harder, being both timed and requiring a good stockpile of the beefier ammo types to chunk away at his health, while also using acid pipes to burn his body parts clean off. But after this, after the missile to destroy Raccoon City is launched, and depending on the route you take, Nikolai is taken care of one way or the other, Jill gets to face against Nemesis's final, much more grotesque form, with a large rail cannon at the disposal of the player to give it one final send-off. But not before Jill holds a magnum to its head and delivers one of the most quotable lines from the original trilogy. Of course. With Nemesis taken care of and the chopper arriving, the original game concludes with a send-off to Raccoon City right before it explodes. The original game is beloved for a large multitude of reasons, and after playing it through, I can see why. The unique blend of this atmospheric tension with this desperate terror strikes a solid balance here, with the Nemesis being the mastermind behind it all. He's a very complex enemy, one that always keeps the player on their toes in fear of him popping right around a corner or leaping off a roof to scare the player into a chase or a fight. The decisions throughout the game create different scenarios for every playthrough, adding on to replayability alongside unlocking outfits for Jill, and a special mercenaries mode where players can mow down enemies at locations from the main game as they run for a target point. The game allows the player to feel both powerless and yet also powerful depending on the scenario. letting the players run wild with assault rifles and grenade launchers, yet also forcing the players to directly confront tough enemies like hunters, gravediggers, and of course, the Nemesis boss fights. The locations are quite memorable, the puzzles further playing into them, with some being more memorable than any others for fans of the series. And of course, with Jill as the main protagonist of it all, it creates an iconic story for an iconic character of an iconic franchise, likely being her defining story in the series for some of the fans out there. As I said earlier, I actually started off with a remake here since I wanted to review this as a separate game, rather than just being a reimagining of the original story. While there still were moments I couldn't help but compare, I think doing it this way, rather than starting with the original, allowed me to see the argument for those that both love or hate the game a little bit more clearly. Regardless, let's dive into the remake to really see what it's all about here. I absolutely adore this intro sequence, easily being in my top 3 openings for Resident Evil game. With just the opening cutscene, the player gets to see the pandemonium from the outbreak, the people trying to make sense of it all, and of course the development of the brute that is Nemesis himself, being covered up by the shady Umbrella Corporation. But it's after this cutscene where the intro really gets to shine. Of course, Jill is once again the lead role, although rather than placing her in the center of all the chaos that has broken out in the city, the game starts off in her quiet apartment as a dream sequence plays out. She wanders into the bathroom, takes a good look at herself, but then slowly watches as her body starts to decay, to mutate, to become one of the zombies that she found littered throughout the decrepit mansion from the mountains. Rather than just telling the player in another note or diary entry that Jill still suffers trauma from what happened in the original game, the development team deliberately chose to show it through this dream sequence and the apartment scene that follows. It's in disarray, she has this large bulletin board-like setup trying to track down Umbrella's whereabouts, becoming utterly fascinated by the discoveries made while trying to keep it all under wraps. The player can find notes that shows that she can't even leave her own apartment due to these mysterious people keeping watch over her. It is brilliant storytelling without directly telling the player what's going on, but rather letting the player deduce the severity of the situation at hand. Best of all, the entire sequence takes place in first person, making the player really feel as if they are Jill here. They are the ones trapped, traumatized by the events of the Spencer Mansion and what happened to follow afterwards. After some time in the apartment and one of the smoothest transitions from first to third person, the player and Jill are introduced to the Nemesis far earlier this time around, breaking through the wall and immediately pursuing Jill through the apartment complex until she just barely manages to escape. Despite what some say with this being as kind of a bad omen for the amount of scripted sequences to come, and trust me, there are plenty, I still believe having the first encounter being this cinematic-esque chase to really drive in the desperation wasn't necessarily a bad option. It immediately captures the dangerous threat that the Nemesis is, with barely any breathing room the entire time that Jill runs away from the creature. The rest of the intro mostly consists of walking through the now blocked off streets, Brad sacrificing himself for Jill to escape, and meeting Carlos a lot earlier as well, wielding a much longer haircut and more charismatic energy to him this time. One thing that I immediately loved about the remake that the player gets to see quite a bit throughout is relationships between each character being a lot more developed than in the original, and even having time to grow and flourish over the short span the game has. Jill is cautious of Carlos and the rest of his squad at first, but over time he comes to trust Carlos and even rely on him when the going gets tough. The little bits of banter between the two, or between Carlos and Tyrell, allows them to be expressive even during the times they're facing, and I'm all here for it. On the flip side, the player also gets to watch the growing disdain between characters like Jill and Nikolai, seeing how Jill slowly catches on to the more sinister motives for his actions, and what leads into a rather intriguing subplot that the original really just failed to encapsulate throughout its runtime. Finally, with all the intro segments said and done, Jill can really begin to explore the city, with the objective of turning on the power and getting the subway system back online for evacuation. In the original game, I noted that the city sections sometimes felt like they were a little too drawn out, constantly having to backtrack for only an item or two, with very little changing between each time you had to return to a certain location. The remake actually seems to overcompensate for this, because this time, it's actually far too short of a section. The city is gorgeous in terms of visuals and environment. Seeing how the neon signs and the lit up streets clash with the abandoned roads, dark stores, or apartment complexes made the city so much more unique and interesting to explore than the original was, using the same couple colors for a large majority of the areas in that game. Even as the player gets into the areas like the substation or the sewers, the sheer atmosphere, showing how the drain demos have absolutely taken over the substation and turned it into a disgusting nest-like ground for them to roam, while the sewers turn into a breeding grounds for a variant of the hunters, is really something to behold. But unfortunately, this whole chunk of gameplay can easily be summed up in the span of maybe 45 minutes, hour tops. It's really unfortunate considering most sections afterwards aren't nearly as intriguing to look at compared to what is seen here. Building off of this comes the other rather apparent issue, the lack of puzzles and real exploration. Throughout this entire section, there's really only like 3 puzzles in total, one not even being in the city but rather in the sewers, and another being completely optional, that the player encounters between the city at its beginning to when the subway takes off. While the original prided itself for the amount of backtracking and item management when it came to finding all kinds of these key items to progress, the remake instead chooses to really emphasize linear objectives to get the things going. While I don't think the premise of having objectives over fetch quests is inherently bad, replacing all the puzzles with these easy to understand tasks just felt like rather bland with the gameplay, mixed with these like occasional spooks and scares. When it came to exploration, there was at least a little bit more going for it, but it wasn't by much. There were some interesting side objectives, with the lockpick and bolt cutters opening some of the nearby shops, or being able to solve a safe lock in one of the buildings overlooking the city. But again, these were all optional at best and only rewarded the player with more healing, or maybe an extra hit pouch or a grenade. And while on the subject of exploration, the Nemesis when he's not in a scripted sequence is one of the real only things to note besides the environment here. This is pretty much the only moment we'll ever genuinely get to see him unscripted, and it's also where he shines the most overall in terms of his complexity. Finally getting to watch him pursue Jill, use his tentacles and raw strength to throw her around, dashing if she ever gets too far away. This is when the Nemesis is at his scariest, and it's not even close to any other moment of the game. Just like the original, it also rewards the player for unloading into him by dropping crates that can contain gun parts or better supplies to keep the player one step ahead of the game if they face the brute before. But again, because this section is just so short, Nemesis has such a short window of time where he really gets to shine before being thrown off to the side again for more linear engagements to pick him back up. It's truly a shame. The last bit I'll bring up before moving on from the city is the boss fight the game gives at the very end of the city section. I personally think that this fight is the best one between the 4 or so boss fights that are encountered throughout the game. Unlike the others, this one shows Nemesis at his most complex, wielding a devastating flamethrower mixed with some powerful close-range attacks. Mixing this with the smaller arsenal at the time of reaching this fight, it really creates this dreadful but also energizing and intense fight that the other boss fights just won't capture in the same way. So with the city out of the way, let's get into how they handled the RPD this time. Rather than Jill exploring it, the remake opted to have Carlos and his partner Tyrell explore the place in search of Dr. Nathaniel Bard and any evidence they could find of cleaning up the city. Being able to return to this place is already a treat on its own, but to do so with Carlos just makes it even better. We get to see events prior to Resident Evil 2, like how Marvin got infected by Brad, which would lead to the advice he would go on to give Leon about always shooting back, or seeing what led to the hole in the wall to reach the STARS room, which would turn into a whole puzzle for Leon or Claire. Just like the original, we also get to play with the assault rifle, which is a lot more satisfying to use on the zombies and even a licker or two, mowing them down to our heart's content, rather than having to play it safe and run around them. After this, we get to the grand clock tower, and not even go inside. Rather than being an area for Jill and Carlos to explore, the entire clock tower segment has just become a more boring boss fight right outside, before moving the plot along some more. This was when the game really started to show some flaws of being too fast-paced, to the point that it felt even rushed at times, with Nemesis no longer being this brutal yet calculating pursuer, and instead just kind of being this glorified BOW. All that really made him interesting went down the drain. Instead, it turns into this scripted sequence, boss fight, really predictable attack patterns that really made it almost a slog to get through. It made it so that we could move on to better areas of the game a little too quickly, and nothing really had substance anymore. Again, it was just a really big shame. After Jill gets infected here, we return to Carlos's perspective so that we can explore the more expansive hospital. Like the original, the section for Carlos is really good at being a nice balance between being powerless and powerful. On one hand, the hospital is littered with larger zombie groups, and now hunter betas that roam about and take a couple clips from the rifle or a good grenade or two to actually take down, creating a sense of dread anytime you encounter the enemies. However, towards the end of the section, the game goes all out in giving the player a sense of power, as Carlos has to defend Jill, mowing down zombies, hunters, any enemy with a stockpile of ammo and grenades that the game gladly offers, as the player gets to feel like an absolute powerhouse for about a good 5 minutes or so. It's really a nice change of pace for how little it lasts. And overall, I think the hospital in the remake is another moment when the game really gets to shine on its own two legs. I believe it's after the hospital where the game just takes an even further dip for the worse, and it never really climbs back up from here. For one, there's no park that the original had, nor is there a dead factory. Instead, we just get Nest 2. Yep. Remember when I said it was nice not to have a generic laboratory to explore again? For the remake, they disregarded that statement entirely and just made a copy-paste lab segment akin to what Resident Evil 2 already did, and yet somehow made it even faster and worse. Nothing about it is memorable. The game consists of really running around some more enemies and solving a single very simple puzzle to make a vaccine that has very little purpose towards the end of the story. Nikolai gets to show his true intentions, despite the player already having catched on fairly early into the story, and Nemesis has a lame rehash of a boss fight, the only difference being that now Carlos gets to help with dumping acid onto him instead of Jill doing it. I'm actually glad to see Carlos and Jill get to fight together in a tag team for Nemesis, but at the same time, it's just so lame that this boss fight happens to be the least memorable by far. The final fight comes just a little later, the player getting to operate the railgun and go to town on the fully mutated Nemesis. It's a very climactic boss fight for sure, but also one that doesn't really hit on the same level, since most of the boss fights before, it really doesn't feel like they scale in difficulty or fulfillment all that much. Nemesis unfortunately never truly got to be this intimidating, unpredictable force to be reckoned with, so to finally dispose of him just feels meh? The game ends with the vaccine being demolished, ruining most of the purpose behind Nest 2 even existing in the first place. Nikolai's left behind, and the missile blows the city sky high once more. The remake is such a hard game to classify as being good or bad. On one hand, the atmosphere is a shining achievement from the RE engine, with stunning visuals, locations that really convey their moods to the player without even having to try. The desolate city streets, the disgusting sewers, the abandoned hospital grounds, all of it is meticulous in how it was developed, and it looks amazing. The characterization is also really engaging, watching how each character and their relationships with one another gets to unfold and grow over the course of the game. On the other hand, though, the game is incredibly linear and scripted for a hefty chunk, which makes the exploration and puzzle solving cap out at a low amount, makes Nemesis far less threatening as a main antagonist, and all in all, it's just too short of a game with nothing that really defines it for a survival horde or even a horror type of game to begin with. It's just more action with tense moments for the majority of the game. One final thing to mention is the replayability, which the game did try to lean into at least a little bit. There's 5 total difficulties, with Inferno being a very difficult challenge for even veterans of the series. Ranks are still a feature, with challenges awarding that high S rank for beating the game in under a couple of hours. This game also brought back the content shop, where points can be spent on features like infinite ammo weapons, costumes, figurines, and concept art during production of the game. However, Mercenaries is missing, which is a bit of a shame. Overall, while being a game that definitely can be enjoyed and has some strong suits to it, there's just as many critical flaws as a Resident Evil game that weigh it down tremendously, which makes it pretty clear why the game is considered so divisive amidst the community. So we've gone through both of the games now, really dissecting what made them great and what made them a little bit less than great. Let me go on the record and say now that both of these games are good in my personal opinion. Sure, I can definitely see some flaws behind them both, but I still managed to enjoy my time even after I'd fully completed both of them, and I stand behind that firmly. With that out of the way, I think it's best we go over what each game did better than the other, just so we can see the best of both worlds. So first, what did the original do that the remake simply didn't do as well? First, I'd say without a doubt, the locations were way more unique and interesting than what the remake offered. Being able to explore areas like the clock tower, the park, and the dead factory were far more intriguing and investing areas as a player than anything that the sewers or the Nest 2 could even dream of accomplishing. The puzzles were far more engaging, exploration felt more expansive in these areas, and the player had more control over how they wanted to tackle each area as they played the game. Another thing the original did a lot better in my opinion was having a more expansive crafting system, especially when it came to gunpowder. The remake does offer a crafting system between the gunpowder and explosives, but the original had plentiful options for how a player could go about crafting ammunition based on their needs in any given situation by having all forms of ammo from two sources and two sources only, gunpowder A and gunpowder B. Anything from handgun rounds all the way to magnum rounds, with 4 types of different explosive rounds for the grenade launcher, made for a lot of more freedom of how the player wanted to invest their supplies, without the need of constantly juggling 4 types of materials like what the remake tended to do. While this isn't something detrimental, it's more of a quality of life type of thing throughout the gameplay. And of course, I think it is very clear that the Nemesis in the original game is such an intense and intimidating antagonist that the remake fails to encapsulate on all fronts of the character. Nemesis is a true embodiment of a desperation-based horror in the original version, being both unpredictable and relentless, but also rewarding the player greatly for choosing to deal with him head-on rather than running away hoping to save your resources. To add onto this, each fight against him scaled in power throughout the game, starting as him just chasing you around and grabbing onto you, before eventually learning how to commandeer a rocket launcher and use a mutated tentacle to snag onto you, and eventually becoming a mutated bioweapon to be reckoned with. All the while, you also slowly expand your arsenal to accommodate for the scaling and power of your enemies. Each fight feels fresh and unique compared to the remake, which tended to rehash fights and just feel lazy with how he scales throughout the game. One final thing to add on is the split paths throughout the original that once again add on to both the desperation, but also replayability factors of the game. This was something notably missing from the remake, likely since it wasn't as easy of a game mechanic to throw into the engine, but I still believe that there should be some sort of a way to add in these split-second decisions or moments where the player can decide whether to run or fight, locking the player into the decision after a few seconds have passed. Now going into the remake, the most clear example of what the remake does better is the atmosphere and characterization. The atmosphere in this game, more specifically the visuals, is fantastic. Having stark contrast between vibrant colors and dark abandoned streets, or dimly lit hallways with blood splatters and glass shards, does a splendid job of getting the player engrossed in each environment around Jill or Carlos as they explore and fight closer and closer to their escape. On top of that, the charming character interactions and how the characters' relationships grow, for better or worse, over time allows the game to really bring out its story that, while the original had, wasn't always pushed as often as it should have been. Another aspect done quite well was Carlos's sections, both the RPD and hospital. Both of these give the player a nice blend of both being the aggressor with a strong assault rifle to mow down your enemies, while still becoming a survivor from the lickers or hunters, requiring lots of lead to take down, meaning that you had to stockpile ammo and be able to aim for when it counts. The tension is still able to build up from the darker corridors and brief flashes of an enemy racing by, and these areas always do a good job in not overstaying their welcome. One final aspect I believe this game does accomplish better than the original was, to a degree, replayability. While the game didn't have Mercenaries mode, and it didn't have the split paths from the option system, it does make up for it with 5 different difficulties and the content shop with some very fun weapons to toy around with after a couple playthroughs of the game, including a knife being able to burn your enemies alive, and the infinite rocket launcher. Beyond that, being able to unlock other things like the outfits for Jill and some concept art adds some extra progression and rewards full completion of the game's challenges. So now with everything fully out of the way, I think it's time we finally get to visualize what the perfect Resident Evil 3 remake would have looked like. For this, I'm going to be doing my best to incorporate what both versions had game-wise and story-wise to make them enjoyable, so that the gameplay sounds intriguing, while the narratives and visuals are still investing. I'll occasionally explain my reasoning as to why certain elements are included, but for the most part this will just be one continuously flowing narrative, shifting between the perspective of the player for the gameplay elements and Jill for the plot. The intro opens with flashing scenes of the newest viral outbreak known to humankind. People are running through the streets frantically, reporters trying to cover the cases of a new cannibal disease, as people have been said to devour others. Police and the CDC are doing everything in their power to disperse the riots and groups of people in fear of the contagion spreading further. But by then it was too late. Buildings were already burning down and falling apart, larger and larger groupings of people gathered in the streets, people turning into what could only be described as zombies. Raccoon City was falling apart, and in the midst of it all was a company holding it all up, Umbrella Corporation. Their commercial plays as if nothing is wrong, people seen in surgical attire and hazmat suits as they prepare their largest creation yet in the biomedical field, a BOW known only as the Nemesis. Jill wakes up in a dark apartment, all the lights turned off while it storms outside. The player finally gains control in a first-person perspective and is free to wander about this new environment, although nothing is interactable besides a singular door in the back that leads into a tight bathroom. It's only barely brighter here as a single light is turned on, illuminating the running sink and bathroom countertop littered with pills, hygiene products, and oddly enough, a handgun. As Jill shuts off the sink, suddenly her hand starts rotting. Pores begin to open up in her arm, blood droplets falling from her nose into the sink, veins more visible as it continues up her arm and towards the rest of her body. She takes a step back, staring first at her arm before seeing her reflection in the mirror. Her whole body looks like it's decaying, one of her eyes going white as she starts heaving. She nearly falls onto the floor, but she's able to catch herself on the countertop, heaving harder as she hoists herself up. She looks at herself again. She looks awful, her skin dry and falling apart, shaking and heaving with blood running down her nose and off her lip. She was turning into one of them, and she knew it. Looking back at the gun, she forcibly took it and turned the safety off, pointing it towards her own head. She had nothing left at this point, except to hope that this would be the one thing to keep her down for good. All that's heard is a loud bang before the screen goes black. She then awakens at her desk in a cold sweat, looking around for a moment while breathing heavily. It was all just a dream, thankfully. She curses to herself as she gets up, noting how the nightmares have only gotten worse over time. The player once again assumes control, although this time the apartment is now up for exploration. The player leads Jill around, her commenting on how she's supposed to leave in 3 days, how there's a lot of pills on her nightstand, or the lack of food left in the fridge. There's also a few notes presumably written by Jill on a board next to the desk. Each one is a report from only a few days ago as Jill reports her experiences from up in the Spencer mansion. The T-virus was encountered in the mountains, as well as investigations done between then and now on the Umbrella Corporation responsible for it all. As the player enters the kitchen, they find another note from none other than Brad Vickers, former pilot for the Alpha team of STARS, talking about the disbanding of the entire division and Jill's ultimate suspension, as well as an unsealed letter from Jill saying that forces have been surrounding her apartment complex, waiting for her, and that she's going to sneak out in 5 days' time as of writing the letter, bringing more insight into why Jill's been cooped up in her apartment for so long with all these reports and research tucked away inside the only safe place she has left, her own apartment. As Jill once again enters the bathroom and turns on the lights, we get a more clear reflection of her, this time not looking too disheveled, if a little tired still. The camera then suddenly shifts, and now the player sees Jill in a third-person over-the-shoulder perspective now that the game is fully in motion. A call comes from the kitchen, the player making their way over to answer it. Jill picks up the phone, shocked to hear that it's Brad, sounding quite frightened. He explains how the city's in disarray, and something has been after him, and evidently, now Jill. Confused, she says she'll get her stuff, but mid-sentence gets cut off, as something bashes through her own apartment wall, breaking inside. The thing is massive, its face and garments masked off for some reason. Jill finds her gun beside her and begins to shoot at it, but it proves futile. It grabs a hold of her, throwing her through the wall behind her before closing the gap once more. Even more confused and now injured, Jill makes a break for it. The whole apartment complex is now burning down, this creature unfazed as it continues to pursue Jill through the smoke and rubble. Only out of sheer luck, it seems, does Jill escape through the side of the building, taking a second to collect herself before stumbling out of the alleyway into the city. If this all sounds rather familiar, it honestly should. This is identical to the intro of the remake, and I felt that this was intentional to keep it this way, for how well it serves as the opening moments of the game, showing the sheer chaos of the city, showing Jill's own trauma from the events in the Spencer mansion, and overall how Jill's been doing between the former event from Resident Evil 1 to now, and the state of things before Nemesis comes in, kicking off the narrative as the inciting incident, was done really well here compared to the original where the player is just thrown in with very little context. Jill soon meets up with Brad, who's winded from all the running. He explains how the city's been going downhill rapidly, the police numbers dwindling, with Brad and Jill being the only two Special Forces members left. The player leads Jill through the now crumbling down city behind Brad as he speaks, fences having been built up that separates the remaining survivors from the hordes of zombies stumbling outside. As they're about to go through a diner to cut through part of the city, the fences start collapsing as the zombies begin to shamble towards the two. Brad commands Jill to go first since she's unarmed now, the player racing for the diner as Brad fires a couple bullets at the incoming horde. Unfortunately, Brad stuck around for just a moment too late, as on his way into the diner his arm is bitten by a zombie, yelping in pain before Jill kicks the zombie back and shuts the door. She races over to Brad asking if he's okay, to which he shakes off and tells her that he'll be okay. Jill's still clearly concerned, but trusting Brad, she backs down and asks where they have to go now. Brad tells her that the best course of action would be to try and signal down one of the helicopters that have been leading survivors out of the city, noting the nearby parking garage that should be high and open enough to do the trick. As Jill's ready to leave, however, Brad stops her and hands her both his handgun and a small lighter engraved with the star's logo on it. He tells her to keep them, considering he might not have much use for them, given his own condition. She has a pained expression, but nods before the two walk out another back alley. The two walk along, Jill now in front instead of Brad, so that she can cover for the two as they make their way towards the parking garage. Along the way, they go through a warehouse where they find Dario Grasso, a paranoid survivor who ends up locking himself inside a nearby shipping container. Even with Jill's pleas for him to come along, Dario refuses and tells the two to beat it. It was no use to keep pleading, so Jill continues on. The two continue, making their way through the warehouse and finally to the parking garage. A few zombies end up blocking the path, Jill having to kill them off while the player learns how to aim and shoot their weapon, a useful mechanic for the rest of the game. They make their way into the nearby elevator and go up to the top floor, Brad's condition looking like it's only getting worse as he heaves a little and bends over. Jill keeps him steady, but shows some clear concern. As the elevator dings and the doors open, a helicopter light blinds the two. A speaker comes on, informing the two to find somewhere more open on the roof of the parking garage so that they can land and pick them up, hoping to get out. Jill keeps leading the two forward, weaving through some cars before spotting the helicopter slowly landing before them, only a few steps away from their freedom. But as the two get closer, the helicopter suddenly explodes in a fiery ball of flames, a large creature seen breaking the helicopter apart. Jill freezes, but Brad's clearly upset, ready to use his only remaining energy to take down this creature. Rather than fighting alongside Brad, Jill takes the smarter option of finding an escape for the two, running for an open car and getting it fired up before yelling at Brad to get inside. He hesitates at first, but seeing the massive beast lurking towards him, he runs into the car before Jill slams on the gas, going straight for the thing. But it catches the car, stalling the two as it uses its free hand to break the windshield and grab onto Jill's neck. Brad tries to use his knife to break the creature's hold, but it won't let up. It's only once Jill revs the car up enough that the car lurches forward, speeding up on a crash course off the side of the building. Down they spiral, the car landing straight onto the creature before tumbling along the street, sparks flying and parts of the car breaking off. Jill groans, Brad coughing heavily a few feet away from the now tipped over car. She starts to crawl out, heaving and holding onto her side in pain. As she's crawling, however, she watches as the creature gets back up, its face now fully visible, and very clearly not a human. This thing was a BOW, one that instantly reminded her of the Spencer mansion. Spotting her gun in the wreckage, she starts to crawl for it as Brad gets up and wields his knife. It was too late, though. Always had been. The creature grabbed onto Brad's head, hoisting him up in its grip and heaving out the word "stars" before clamping down on his head, it popping like a balloon just barely off screen as the blood is seen splattering and coating the creature's hand. All that was left was Jill, holding onto the handgun as she fired the full clip into it, all for nothing. Nothing stopped its approach. Nothing. Until a rocket flies past her and straight towards the creature. It catches the first one and leads it off, before a second slams right into its chest, sending it backwards as it collapses down. The newcomer rushes to Jill's aid, hoisting her up and carrying her off from the scene as Jill's vision gets hazy and cloudy, the adrenaline now wearing off. Regarding the opening moments exploring the chaotic city, keeping it close to the remake allows for the pacing to ramp up without instantly thrusting the player into the game. Again, one small gripe with the original game I had. But it also isn't super slow paced to the point that it feels like a chore before actually getting into the game. It serves as a tutorial section with how to fight back against the threats to come and outlines the difficulty the player has chosen based on how easy or hard it is to weave through those initial zombies at the diner and parking garage. Having Brad die by Nemesis rather than being left behind by a basic zombie not only gives a personal connection to the first weapon that Jill will receive, but also makes Nemesis all the more intimidating as he kills Brad rather than Carlos killing him later on at the RPD. Nemesis has now already completed half its task in eliminating stars, leaving only Jill, the person the player is in charge of. The whole sequence towards the end now ramps up the stakes and gives more motivation for Jill, and in turn the player, to escape the city before it's too late, kicking off the game. The scene cuts to an underground subway entrance, the newcomer letting Jill go as she catches her breath. He tells her that they need to go around to the main gate in order to reach a couple subway cars serving as shelter from the zombies, to which Jill agrees and follows. The two have some tense banter, the player learning that this newcomer is part of the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service, or UBCS, ticking Jill off pretty quickly. He explains, however, that he's only there to help those alive and has nothing to do with anything nefarious, and that he's going to a squad with or without her. With nowhere else to go, Jill continues to follow despite her uneasiness. The two reach the subway cars, where another soldier is seen sitting inside. The player learns that the one who saved us is named Carlos Oliveira, with the one sitting down, the platoon leader, Mikhail Victor. We learn that what Carlos says is all true, some survivors seen in a neighboring subway car looking equally disheveled and nervous about what was going on above. Mikhail explains, however, that his squadron has suffered many losses and that they need to help with being able to get the tram going. Jill, still distasteful about working with Umbrella operatives, agrees on behalf of saving the survivors. Carlos proceeds to hand Jill a radio to stay in contact before saying that they need to gear up and discuss plans for getting things in motion. Finally, the player regains control of Jill. While Carlos and Mikhail talk in the background, the player is able to make their way out of the subway and up towards the topside area. Along the way, there are some notes regarding certain gameplay mechanics, including how to dodge enemies, how herbs and crafting works, and how different gunpowder types are able to craft different ammo, creating incentive for the player to stock up in case they want stronger ammo in the later stages of the game. On top of these files is a tabloid that discusses earlier stages of the outbreak, as a reporter labels the virus as the cannibal disease and urges readers to turn the page for more information. Of course, the player doesn't have the time to indulge, though, in such readings. Continuing upstairs, the player finds their very first save room with a couple herbs, handgun bullets, a typewriter, and an item box. On the other side is a shutter door leading back outside to the dangers the city poses to Jill. Whenever the player is ready, they lead Jill under the shutter and out into the unknown. As Jill leaves, another survivor rushes towards the door, half barreling under before slamming the shutter door behind Jill, trapping her outside now as a real survivor horror can begin. After some time wandering through the side alleys, Jill arrives at the main uptown sector. Neon lights still illuminate the damp city streets. A light wind shifts the tree branches and bushes around her, smoke and signs of fires seen in the distant atmosphere as little puddles where the rainwater had accumulated build up. Zombies continuously trying to knock down the fences put up around the city are seen in the distance. As Jill begins to explore, she gets a call from Carlos, explaining that before they can start to fix the subway, Jill will need to reach further downtown to where the substation is located in order to reactivate the main power grid. Unfortunately, as Jill looks to her side, the only way down is through an alleyway currently up in flames. Now, with the new objective in mind, the player is able to explore the first real area of the game in search of how to reach the downtown section. When first exploring the uptown, many areas are locked by ropes or certain types of locks, giving incentive to further explore each area thoroughly where new key items have been obtained. For example, while the lighter is capable of burning off the lighter rope bounding the door handles, different items would be needed for opening simple locks. Along the way, the player can also find a shotgun within a safe, with a note directing the player to Aquacure for the combination, which can be found inside a local advertisement at a pharmacy not too far away from this apartment. A diner separates the two streets, containing some handgun bullets and gunpowder inside, as well as a safe room in the back if the player needs it. At the far end is the subway station, where the player is able to find the fire hose messily laid about on the floor. A few other notes are found regarding a later puzzle of the subway after the power is back online, and how rerouting the subway is required before it can leave. Upon taking off with the fire hose, the daunting creature from before reveals itself once again from the apartments or the diner based on RNG. Jill, cursing to herself, she begins to run as it pursues her throughout the uptown. The player can choose to fight if they so do so, awarding the player with parts for their current handgun that can double the size of their clip. Or they can run until they manage to use the fire hose to put the fire out in the alleyway and get out. Regardless of which option they choose, soon the player is on their way to the downtown area, one step closer to the substation. This area was also left fairly close to how it was in the remake, although for the purpose of exploration, there were a few items switched around, making them slightly harder to obtain and encouraging even further exploration. I felt as though it would make more sense for the safe owner in the apartment to have something of more value than just a simple gun part, and having the shotgun be randomly placed in the subway station felt slightly awkward. So instead, having the shotgun in the apartment safe eliminates both of these issues and brings more value to exploring the area fully. On top of this, having Nemesis spawn in much sooner immediately ramps up the intensity and desperation, the player most likely only having a pistol or perhaps a shotgun with a few shells in order to deal with the threat. Upon Jill reaching downtown, she finds that a gate has the way into the substation blocked off, requiring a simple lock to open it up, as well as a blocked off alleyway needing some kind of wrench. She contacts Carlos about the situation and her encounter with Nemesis, him responding, saying that he'll make his way down to help out Jill while also looking for another operative. Jill manages to find a way through by finding a lockpick just outside the substation, along with some notes talking about new creatures roaming around and using herbs to cure sicknesses that they may cause. As she unlocks the substation door, something crawls from above her, taking a hold of her, infecting her with these bugs as they slide down her throat. Thankfully for Jill, a nearby green herb allows herself to cure herself of the bugs by throwing them up, serving as a warning to the player of what is to come. Running through the substation, multiple breakers require the player to switch them back on while avoiding these new creatures known as drain demos before running into a machinery room. Jill needs to produce a certain voltage level in order to fully reroute the power, completing a puzzle. As she completes it, however, many of the drain damos begin to pile up from where Jill came from. This forces Jill into the first key decision of the game, either running through a nearby emergency exit, or increasing the electrical output. If the player chooses to run away, they'll reactivate the power before making a break for it, the nest seen above them collapsing as she runs, and she'll end up outside another alleyway. The drain damos will still be lurking around and will come back as an extra challenge while exploring the downtown area. If they choose to increase the voltage instead, the nest will still collapse, but this time the drain damos will not be present any longer. This allows them to backtrack a little in order to grab either the magnum or the grenade launcher inside one of the side rooms before continuing on by leaving from where the player came. Regardless of what option is picked, the power is now successfully turned on, meaning that they can now focus on rebuilding the subway and getting it rerouted. Upon leaving the substation, the gate is now unlocked, presumably by Carlos, even though he's nowhere to be seen. It's at this point that a fork in the road is presented, one path leading to a restaurant, and the other down a small alley towards another main road. If the player explores the restaurant first, they find that Carlos is inside working on opening the basement to the restaurant that has been blocked off. Jill is able to open a nearby cabinet containing a fire hook that can open the latch, but halfway through opening, the creature stalking Jill down returns. Jill's given a key decision, being to either finish opening the basement and hide, or to make a break for it. If a player goes down to the basement, they're able to hide from the creature as it searches. In the process, they can find a cable suitable for the subway, meaning that the player doesn't have to backtrack here later on. However, Nemesis will also return much sooner as they leave. If the player instead runs, Jill will throw a lamp at a gas tank within the kitchen, causing it to explode the creature as it's knocked down again. The player can grab more parts for the gun, and the creature will stay down for longer, but at some point they'll have to return to make sure they finish opening the basement for the cable. If nothing is done, the creature will throw them out of the kitchen, forcing the player to run, without the creature being knocked down whatsoever. When the player makes their way through the alleyway, another safe room can be found here which contains shotgun shells and gunpowder. At the other end of the alley, the main road has a couple things worth noting. The first is a locked gate, having a bolt needing a wrench to open up. Down the road is a press office next to a burning truck. As the player enters, they solve a short puzzle to open a shutter before making their way upstairs and finding Murphy Seeker, the formerly mentioned operative Carlos was talking about, with multiple bite wounds and scratches on his body. As he pleads with Jill, a gunshot goes off behind her before Nikolai introduces himself. Jill is already clearly irritated by Nikolai, but he only warns Jill not to be hesitant to pull the trigger on someone already about to die before leaving her. After some quick and uneasy introductions, Jill finds the wrench next to the corpse of Murphy and takes it, but upon trying to leave, the new nemesis of Jill is seen with a burning stairwell behind him, much to the dismay of Jill. It's here that the player reaches another key choice of the game. Jill surveys both of her options, one being the window behind her and the other being the office she just came out from, the player again having mere seconds to pick an option. If the player chooses to run for the window, Jill will dive out and land on a pile of trash outside, cushioning her fall as she stumbles out just as Carlos arrives. This will give the player extra time before Nemesis returns, so long as they don't return to the office immediately. If the player instead chooses to hide in the office, she'll hide underneath the conference table as Nemesis rushes into the room. She silently watches as his footsteps work their way around the table, but just as he's about to destroy it, gunshots are heard outside, catching the attention of Nemesis and giving Jill enough time to dash out and escape, with the Nemesis hot on her heels. Finally, if the player does nothing, Nemesis will simply pummel Jill, and now will force the player to find another way of getting around him and out of the building, playing out similarly to if they hid under the table. One thing to note is that only one of these two key choices, the restaurant or the office, will be presented, depending on which they choose first, meaning that if the players already explore the restaurant, then the office will already be vacant, and Nemesis will not appear after getting the wrench. On the flip side, if the players already acquired the wrench before entering the restaurant, Nemesis will not show up unless he's already following Jill, and Carlos will not be anywhere around the restaurant, since he's already left the downtown area. Using the wrench and the lockpick Jill's acquired, Jill's able to further explore both the uptown and downtown areas. The fuse is now able to be obtained from the subway station back in the uptown area. A short puzzle can be completed to reroute the subway for when it is ready to depart. And in the downtown area, the locked gate can now be opened, leading off to another gas station where the fuel can be obtained after a complicated puzzle. As soon as the puzzles are complete, one of two situations can occur based on what has already happened during the decision made at either the restaurant or office. If the player chose to go to the restaurant, then Carlos will return to check up on Jill after obtaining the fuel. If the player went to the office first, then Jill will instead be on her own, since she'd already seen Carlos earlier. Regardless of what happens, Nemesis will soon be heard and Jill will have to depart from the gas station. He now wields a gnarly-looking flamethrower, which forces her to make a break for it. If Carlos is there, he'll divert Nemesis' attention while Jill escapes. A cutscene playing as Carlos shoots at an explosive barrel and causes the entire gas station to explode, causing the Nemesis to lose her trail. Otherwise, Jill will just have to run. With all the parts now in Jill's possession and the subway both powered and rerouted, it's finally time to get out of the area. Upon making it back to the uptown, however, something immediately feels off. The lights are now flickering, the zombies nowhere to be seen. The large doll head atop one of the stores begins to shift a little bit, right before the player sees the Nemesis already back on Jill's heels. At first she tries to run, but the Nemesis rips the doll head off its hinges, hurling it towards Jill and forcing her to run the other direction before she gets squashed, watching as it collides into the diner after barreling out of harm's way. Jill calls Carlos to inform him of the situation before dashing off once more, eager to get away from her Nemesis. Despite her best efforts, though, this time it seems like the thorn in her side simply won't go away as easily. She makes it to the shutter, Carlos starting to open it as she aims her pistol towards the creature. The player is now able to make one final decision here in the city. Either try to outrun this creature after Carlos manages to open the shutter, or face it down and try to immobilize it for good. The player is given a few seconds to make the choice as the shutter opens, Carlos calling out for Jill to roll under. If the player chooses to, Carlos will shut the shutter door behind Jill and force them both into a chase sequence all the way back down to the subway before being able to separate the pair from it using a nearby vent. Otherwise, Jill will tell Carlos to shut it before readying her arsenal to face down the creature. Now, with a handgun, shotgun, and potentially a stronger weapon at the player's disposal, they're able to do all in their power to take down this behemoth as it shoots out flames and tries to pummel Jill over and over. It's a tense fight as the two weave around the street, between cars that can blow up. Carlos will also occasionally throw out a grenade or some ammo if the fight goes on for long enough, giving the player some extra support. Finally, with enough damage dealt, the flamethrower tank will explode, and the Nemesis will collapse. Jill able to pick up another supply drop before rushing back to the subway. Carlos and a new member, Tyrell Patrick, have a new mission off at the RPD after some new information comes in, leaving the other members and Jill to leave by the subway, saying farewell to the destroyed city. In case this whole section wasn't entirely clear, this heavily focuses on the original game's layout in order to further expand how long the player spends in this location. Some puzzles and key decisions were made so that the section didn't feel like an absolute chore to complete, but still had moments that the player has to make reactive decisions for when Nemesis would show up, and still brought back some of the more iconic puzzles found in the original that were cut in the remake, most notably the substation and gas station. It wasn't easy to bring the first fight from the remake in without having it feel too drawn out, so instead I tried to make it more of this final desperate standoff against the Nemesis before the player has to leave the city behind for good. The player then cuts to Carlos and Tyrell on their new mission to the RPD. As they arrive, they hear some noises that come from within the station, leading the two to make their way inside. They find Marvin shooting down a zombie in its head, holding onto a bite wound on his side before slamming his shutter down that the pair are unable to open. Tyrell curses to himself before starting to look for another way through the station. Besides this, nothing has really changed here from the Resident Evil 2 remake. So to those who have played it already, it'll feel quite similar returning to these halls and dark rooms. They'll be able to see some of the police officers die as they explore, encounter a few lickers along the way, and eventually blow open a wall so they can get to the STAR's office on the other side. When they make it, Tyrell is able to contact Dr. Nathaniel Bard, who is holed up in the hospital nearby with a supposed vaccine, as well as some information on Umbrella. During their talk, Carlos is interrupted to hear that Jill's got a new situation, sounding pained through the radio. He tries to respond, but the line goes dead, leaving Carlos worried about what happened. With a new destination, the two set off. This part of the game really didn't need fixing besides Brad no longer being a part of this area, so instead I chose to have a reference to a note found in the original game written by Marvin, talking about a restaurant owner developing symptoms of becoming a zombie after seeking refuge inside the police station. I found this to be more fitting as a backup for not having Brad be the one to infect Marvin here. Besides that, it plays identical to the remakes. The player cuts back to Jill, seeing what happened just moments earlier. As she sits alongside Mikhail, we hear a short conversation regarding how they ended up on Survivor Roundup duty, Jill showing a little bit of empathy towards him and his team for the first time in the story. However, they are once again interrupted, hearing a loud explosion in the back of the subway. As Jill rushes to investigate, the Nemesis has somehow made it on board, now wielding a rocket launcher to chase them down. She first thinks to run to the front, but Nikolai has already jammed the door shut before taking off. Jill screams at him, but it's of no use. Seeing no other option, Jill and Mikhail try to fight it, but it once again proves futile. In a last-ditch effort, Mikhail sacrifices himself to blow up the car, sending Jill tumbling through the jammed door, and both Nemesis and Mikhail off board. Wasting no time, she rushes past to the front, although now Nikolai is nowhere to be seen. She doesn't have time to question it though, seeing that the brake is no longer working and forcing the player into a decision, to either use the emergency brake or jump out before it crashes. If the player chooses to stop the train, they use the emergency brake and screech it to a stop before stepping out, finding it crashed just below the clock tower of the city. This will pop the player out in the altar room after making it out from underground, rather than the front door of the clock tower. If the player instead chooses to jump out early, the train will race on and crash, stumbling through some tunnels before being able to fully see the clock tower in all its glory, rushing to it for some sense of safety. Jill finds another dead soldier in the Umbrella unit, learning the backup plan involves getting the bell at the very top of the tower to ring in order to call down a helicopter, which she now sets out to accomplish. Avoiding large spiders, solving crystal ball puzzles, and gaining more keys, she soon makes it to the very top with a special gear able to ring the bell. On her way up though, she once again finds the Nemesis, who somehow didn't die. He has started to wear down though, showing new mutations as he approaches Jill. The player is able to make another key decision here, either using the light to blind the Nemesis and send him tumbling, or using the live wires to temporarily knock him out and gain yet another supply stash. Either way, now with him dealt with, she's able to fix the clock mechanism and ring the grand bell. As she runs through the courtyard, Jill watches as a helicopter flies in, throwing the ladder down to get them out. But just before she can reach it, the helicopter explodes, the Nemesis wielding his rocket launcher as he turns to Jill. This fight will then change based on what option Jill chose when inside the subway. If the player just chose to jump out, then Jill will be forced to fight the Nemesis on her own, dodging rockets and charges to her in the tight courtyard area. However, if the player chose to stop the tram, then Carlos will arrive on the scene and fire into the Nemesis, breaking the rocket launcher and only allowing the Nemesis to use a tentacle-like weapon against Jill instead, making it harder to run away and keep distance from it. After a long barrage of attacks and bullets fired, the Nemesis is once again eventually put down, but not before lodging a spike straight into Jill, her wincing as she pulls it out before collapsing. Carlos makes his way over to Jill, carrying her off in hopes of finding a way to cure her. The clock tower was brought back to the remake mostly as is, since it's easily the most iconic section of the original game for many players, and proves to be one of the most unique in the entire original trilogy. While there still are a couple rooms that may not have needed to be around, for the most part it was fine as is, and all it really needed was to be ported over into the remake. As Carlos arrives, he sets Jill down on a gurney in a nearby room, barricading it behind him before exploring the hospital for both Bard and a vaccine. It takes some time as Hunter Betas show up, contesting different parts of the hospital on top of larger crowds of zombie patients and infected doctors, but Carlos is not easy to take down, using his rifle to blast through them as he reaches the top office. But he's already too late. Bard is now dead, a recording on his computer being the last trace of his own life. Carlos plays it, Bard rushing to explain the real motives behind Umbrella, covering up the entire incident of the city and moving forward with plans involving viruses and research that they had earlier. Carlos is fed up, but his priority now remains to cure Jill. Thus, he uses a computer to discover how to make a cure using a base and a medium he can find in the hospital. With more exploration and puzzles solved, he's able to develop a singular dose of the vaccine, running back down and sticking it in Jill's arm. Tyrell arrives shortly after, warning him of the situation worsening outside. Carlos says to hold out with Jill as he rushes to the lobby, ready for a fight. And boy is there a fight, going to town on zombie after zombie, hunter after hunter that pours in while Tyrell focuses on shutting the windows and eventually using a detonator to collapse a pillar into the only remaining way inside. After the mess, Carlos runs back into the room, a broadcast on the television suddenly coming on talking about a missile heading straight for the city. It'll only take a couple hours at this point. It's already too late for help. All that's left is to escape. Tyrell says he'll wait with Jill while Carlos scouts ahead to clear a way forward. With only a nod, Carlos rushes off. This section was my personal favorite part of the remake, and I intended to keep it similar with the remake, with its clean blend of scares and tension, but also giving the player some action and a feeling of being powerful against the hordes, both inside and outside. By adding the original puzzles for the vaccine, it also gives the hospital a little bit more time to shine without overstaying its welcome. As Jill awakens, Tyrell eases her up and informs her of the situation with the missile. Jill's shocked, but it also serves as a wake-up call to get moving. She makes her way out of the hospital through a back door, Tyrell saying that he'll stick behind and gather some extra data from the doctor's office before catching up. Jill nods, heading back out into the streets. A nearby safe room is found so the player can get comfortable and pick up a key belonging to the Raccoon City park nearby. With only one way forward, Jill makes her way over and unlocks the gate to get inside. The park itself is a melancholy type of site, with it being both luscious and natural looking with the many trees and plants starting to transition into an autumn atmosphere, yet also being completely barren with only a couple lights above Jill to illuminate the otherwise dark environment. There are more hunters that show up here, both betas as well as a new form known as gammas, which were initially bred in a research lab by Umbrella before being taken to the park in an underground site hidden from the general public. Jill's able to fight through them, solving more puzzles and gaining more keys until she's able to reach a nearby shack behind a graveyard with more than meets the eye. Hiding in a secret room is another Umbrella site, used by supervisors to overwatch the situation at hand and gain information on the progress Umbrella had been making. Jill's able to overhear a transmission calling all remaining members to pull out of the city, as well as finding a key to finally leave the park. Upon trying to leave, however, Nikolai stops her, to which Jill immediately starts to lay into him for leaving Mikhail and herself to die in the subway. But once again, he just repeats his advice. Every man for himself. Tyrell also makes it back, breaking the two apart and immediately sharing what he found regarding the corporation. Nikolai, however, doesn't seem to care, instead revealing his more malicious motives as the ground shakes. He already knew about Umbrella, and only wished to make some profit. He then sets off for the last rendezvous point, a nearby factory run by the city, and thus Umbrella as well. Jill tries to follow, but suddenly the ground begins to shake, separating her and Tyrell from pursuing Nikolai. The ground shakes and shakes until Jill falls through the ground, the graveyard and shack tumbling down until only a pit remains with large dirt walls surrounding Jill. She readies up her arsenal just as a massive worm-like creature arrives, known as the Gravedigger. It goes straight for Tyrell first as he shoots at the creature, although it's barely phased as Tyrell is swallowed whole. With no other options, Jill's forced to fight the beast, going at it with all the ammo she has. It's a long fight, but eventually she's able to put it down for good, it tumbling over and knocking over a piece of the metal fence that Jill's able to use to climb back out and get out of the park for good this time. The park itself was another short but sweet section of the original, needing very little in terms of a redesign. The only real aspect that was chosen was making the Gravedigger arena slightly bigger rather than having it just be a snaking little arena. While it worked then, for a 3D remake, it wouldn't really hold up well if it was that cramped. As Jill approaches the factory, she hears something like a low groan, as if trying to say something, but upon a second time, she recognizes it. It's Nemesis. He's already back, leaping onto the bridge she's on, and Jill must once again make a decision. She can either push the nemesis off, or jump off the bridge herself into the gaping abyss below. Choosing to shove the nemesis off allows Jill to enter from the main entrance, already having access to some early items and puzzles needed to get through the factory, and will also prevent nemesis from being present in the factory. If she jumps off instead, she'll end up in the bottom floor of the factory and will have to fight through some enemies to get back to the upper floor. However, she also gets to eliminate many of the enemies early, so that exploration later proves to be easier. After opening up the factory, Jill finally gets to encounter Nikolai again. The two get into a little shootout, going at each other, while Nikolai reveals his true intentions to profit off the combat data between Jill and the nemesis, selling it to the best bidder he can find after. But as the shootout pauses, Jill is shoved into a containment unit before the door slams shut. The nemesis arrives once more, now even more mutated. Nikolai rushes off as a countdown begins, Jill having to get out before she's dropped into a vat of acid underneath both her and the nemesis. This fight is easily the hardest one of all, the timer continuing to tick down as Jill goes at the mutated nemesis with all she has at her disposal, showing zero mercy. About halfway through, Carlos arrives, helping Jill by being able to activate acid pipes that Jill can shoot, acid spilling all over the nemesis and dealing lots of damage. With only moments to spare, Jill and Carlos take the creature down and rush to escape before the contents of the room are dumped into the vat of acid, nemesis roaring below Jill as she never looks back. She runs through the factory, now with a key card to get out. Carlos calls her, telling her that she can snag a helicopter from a nearby hangar. She makes a break for it, but as she reaches a hangar, the worst possible outcome occurs. The nemesis is still not dead, now being a disgusting blob of flesh hurling itself towards her. She runs inside, finding a prototype railgun, requiring it to be booted up, and the batteries inserted. As time runs out, she activates it as the nemesis crashes in, creating a desperate feeling in the player to get this railgun up and running to finally dispose the creature. Jill dodges under dysmorphic tentacles, blasts at this disgusting mouth the creature has, narrowly avoiding acid puddles it leaves behind as she shoves the batteries back into place. The railgun finally goes online, and with a final flash, the nemesis is blasted into it, collapsing on the ground and twitching on its last spark of life. Jill walks up to it, out of breath, injured as all hell, and exhausted. Pointing the magnum to the creature's head, she mutters only one thing. "You want stars? I'll give you stars." She fires the last bullet in the chamber, killing it for good before making it outside. She finds Nikolai and Carlos now in a scuffle, Jill joining in soon after. The fight ends with Carlos getting Nikolai in a chokehold and Jill firing a bullet into Nikolai's chest, injuring him. Carlos and Jill barely even look back, rushing for the nearest helicopter and flying away. They watch as a missile flies right past them, landing in the center of the city. A large flash coats the sky as the blast envelops the entire city, leaving it all to ruin. Their story, and the story of Raccoon City, is finally over. I knew from the moment I started this project that the Dead Factory needed to be the final area. It was so much more unique than what Nest 2 accomplished, and really made the finale of Raccoon City feel conclusive and deserved, after all the hardships that Jill is forced to endure since the beginning of the game. I loved this ending far more than what the remake did, but I still wanted to include the moment with having Nikolai being left to die in the city's explosion, since the player doesn't get the choice to do so by shooting them in the helicopter like the original game has. I also wanted to keep the badass voice line for the very end, like the original does, rather than being a throwaway line like the remake did. After the game ends, the player is awarded with some points that they can go spend in the content shop. It's similar to what the remake offers, but there's two notable differences. First, a fully playable Mercenaries mode is now in the shop for only 10 points, serving as a modern version of the original Mercenaries from the original game. There's also new characters to play as in this mode, such as Jill, Tyrell, and even Leon and Claire from Resident Evil 2, each character having their own loadout to make it through the city alive. It's not as expansive as what the Resident Evil 4 remake did, but it's still enough to add some extra content. Second, the shop also has a lot more costume options for Jill and Carlos, some being ported versions of what the original costumes were from the original game that just never made it into the remake. This whole project was insanely difficult to make since it's the first time I've ever done a larger scale video, requiring actually recording footage and going through it, playing the games, and doing something that I previously really only dreamed of doing. This script ended up being over 30 pages long. Do I regret it? No. In fact, it was super fun to try this out for a change, and perhaps this has opened the gateway to do a lot more of these, hopefully with some better equipment and mic quality and like literally everything. I might even get some of my friends on board if they're willing to. That all depends on how this comes together though, so if you did enjoy it, I would seriously appreciate it just to see a little bit of support and what could be done better in the future. Besides that though, I'll leave this conclusion fairly short. Thanks for watching, and stay cheesy.